All right, so one thing that we talk about a lot in algebra is domain and range. Domain is how far a graph goes from the left all the way to the right. And there's certain notation, which notation is like how we write it. And we'll kind of get into that later. But domain is the x values from the left all the way to the x values on the right. And then range would be just the opposite. So we're talking about the y values, so the lowest y values to the highest y values. So if we look at this example, we look at this graph, and let's try to talk about the domain first. So the domain would be how far left does this graph go to how far right. And when we first look at a graph like this, it's really common for a student to say, well, the domain, how far left to how far right would be negative 12 to positive 12, right? Because the graph crosses negative 12 and then crosses positive 12 over here. But notice that our red graph actually keeps going further and further past negative 12, right? So maybe it's like negative 15, maybe it's positive 15 or positive 16, but let's just keep that in mind. But that's just a common mistake that we often see. Um, and then a lot of times we say that the range would be from like negative 8 to 0 or to positive 8. Just a lot of that's what we saw a lot of last year. But what I want you to really see is the arrows in this graph. See how and they mean that the graph will just keep going. So if we zoom out on this, and on a paper or on like a quiz, you won't see the zoom out, but you can imagine this. So if I zoom out on this picture, what happens to this graph? It keeps going forever and ever, right? It just keeps going higher and higher and higher, and then further and further to the right, higher and higher and higher, and further to the left. I'll try to get that big screen. So instead of just saying the domain would be negative 12 to positive 12, right? We see that this red graph, even though you might not see this higher point of the line, we know in our heads that this line will just keep going off the page, off the page, off the page. So really the domain keeps going left, or we say it goes to negative infinity. It never stops going left this way, even though the graph kind of goes at an angle, and then it never stops going to the right. So the x values keep going further and further to the right. Now with the range, so we're talking about the y values, does it ever go below negative 8? Nope, we'd have no part of the graph down here, but we do have y values, because if I go way up here on the y-axis and I go over to the left, am I going to run into my line? Yep. Am I going to run into my line over here? Yep. So the y value just keeps going up and up and up. So we say that a range is negative 8 from down here all the way to positive infinity, because we can just keep going up and up and up in our graph. That's just some common mistakes that we saw last year. I'm sure we'll run into it this year, but hopefully this video helps a little bit. If you need further explanation, let me know.